So in the last video, we started the introduction to HTML, and we did some real basic HTML layout. And before you can go pretty much anywhere in web development, as well as HTML, you simply need to know CSS, which is basically the styling section. So HTML is like your definition of document structure and layout, and the CSS is the styling of that. So we're going to go ahead and get a very limited introduction to CSS, but we'll go through the key concepts. There's not much to know about CSS. It's pretty simple to do. So we'll cover just the basics in this video, and then go into more detail, in the subsequent videos. But we're going to cover the basic understanding in depth. So we'll start with just making a new folder. We'll just call it web, and then in here we'll make a new file. Or let's just open Visual Studio Code and let's make a new file. And then in here, I'm just going to paste in what we had in the last video in the HTML. So we've got the document type, HTML, the HTML element, the header. I've added this meta, which I didn't put in the first video just to not confuse things. But good practice in HTML5 documents or HTML documents in general is to specify the format, the file encoding, if you will, of this HTML page. And we're specifying UTF-8 as the standard, which is the most common file format for. It's mainly when you insert special characters into the document, outside of the ASCII character range. So for now, you don't need to know much about that. Just simply place this in and understand that it's about formatting special characters in the document. Everything else is the same as the last video, the title of the web page. I've also added this, which we'll take out for the moment, which is the style sheet. So this structure is, your blank HTML document. So we'll save that file and we'll call it index.htm. And now we have a HTML document ready to go. If you haven't already, go to extensions, install live server by just searching for it and clicking install. Then HTML snippets is a good one to install as well. That will give you some tool tips as we're typing. So install those two. You don't need to install this Sass. We'll get to that in a few more videos. So just install live server and HTML snippets. And then with those installed, you'll get basic IntelliSense like typing H1 and for a header. And you get this, well, you don't get any real info there, but say type div, and this is the HTML snippet thing popping up, giving you some, details about it. So with those installed and that ready, let's first just put something in this document. So let's put header 1, my heading 1. We'll put a paragraph as well. My text is in here. And save that. Now, in order to view and edit this live, when you've installed this live server, you can see down the bottom here you've got Go Live. So just click that button and it will start, and then it tells you that it's started on port 5500, and then it opens up. Let me just quickly toggle on my inverted colors for now to not blind the eyes. So this is the HTML document. If we just drag this to the corner and then use this as in the other corner, we've now got basically side-by-side editing. So I can go ahead and change this and you'll see it live update here. So we've got like this nice layout. This is how we'll work. Also, instead of having a file, just individual files open, we'll click open folder. And to do that, in case you missed, I clicked up here first. So the file icon, then open folder, and then select the folder we're working in and open. And that just gives us a bit more, any files that appear in that folder will now appear here in this folder. We can also create a new file directly in this folder, which is what we'll do next. And you can just click to open the files. So that's killed Go Live, so we just have to click the Go Live again just to start that back up. So that's up there. So now we have a nice working environment for working with HTML. So in order to then style this document, you need CSS. So you need to either add CSS directly, which is not recommended, which should add here, which you can do style and then you could say H1, and I'll explain the syntax later. I'm just quickly showing you that you could put it in there, you know, directly in here. And now if I turn off my thing there, you can see it's red. So you can embed styles directly in the head of a document, but that is just simply not recommended. So we'll remove that. Instead, what we'll do is create an actual CSS file. So we'll just click new file over here and just call it style.css for now, and it's blank. Let's put that header 1 back in, and again I'll explain the syntax in a minute. I'll do color red and save. Now if we save this with no style, you can see it's gone. So in order to get that style back, we want to link this style sheet, and it's all you have to do is specify what you saw when I initially pasted is link, and then href for the location. Do / at the start, which means the relative folder where the whole website's running, not specific to this file if this was in a subfolder. So / and then that brings us to effectively the top folder, which is web, and then just style.css. And then we'll also put rel style sheet, which is basically the thing you need to do to make it correct HTML. So it would work without typing these, but this is the correct structure of a link. So that's the rel, and then you've also got the type to tell the browser that the type, minimize that, the type is text / CSS, and then your closing tag. So that's the standard way of basically including a style sheet, and the only thing that ever changes is simply this, the location. So that's kind of a, get that ingrained in your memory, and all you have to do then is change the file name. So if I save this file, you can see now it's updated here. If I press F12 in Firefox and I just make a change back in here to reload, you can see here's the file uploaded. The get that over there in a minute. The index.html, and you can also see it loaded the style, the style sheet, the style.css. So now we have a link to a style sheet for this web page. So now we can start styling this page. So that really brings us on to the actual CSS. So we've done all this HTML and what this means in the last video. So if you don't know what the basic HTML means, you can watch the previous video. And then all we've had to do is include this link here and pass it into, you know, the actual file path of where this document is. So now we have a style sheet we can start working on. So CSS is different than HTML. Has been very similar to like WPF, which we've been doing videos on. So it's an XML style document. Style sheets, so CSS is not really the same. It's got a vague similarity to C# and other coding languages, in which you have, you know, like a name and a, you know, your curly brackets and then stuff inside. It's also similar to, say, JSON, if you've ever done JSON. But it's really easy syntax. There's basically what you're looking at now is the whole of CSS right there. There's not really anything else that you do syntax wise, bar your attributes having potentially, you know, some brackets in with some paths in, or defining, you know, colors in certain ways with hash tags and, you know, real simple things. But in essence, what you're looking at is all you really need to know about CSS. So we'll get started. We have this is called the selector. So let me just zoom in on this. We don't need to go that big, but I might as well keep it huge at the minute. So this is known as the selector, and this is what tells the code inside here where to be applied to. So we have selected the heading. We've selected H1, which in our document, this is an element. It's a, you know, an element. The way we've selected it is by doing an element. When you simply type a name without a special prefix, then it's classed as an element selector. So this is the selector, and this means what do you want to apply the style to. In this case, it's a heading of 1. And then inside here, you've basically got your property and your property value. So you've got the property of color, and this is where this is a CSS property. So color is now specific to CSS. So if we did another property and called it background and a black, then you can see it'll change the background of the heading to black. So this is where you start styling. This this is where you'll learn all the things in CSS of what these properties are and what they mean. And then the thing that's wrapped around here is basically selecting and filtering down to what it should be applied to. In this case, a heading 1. So that's the real start, that we can now select elements and style things. So to first get this nicer on the eye, just because I like everything dark, I'm going to select HTML, the element HTML. And if you look in here, that means it's going to select this whole document. It's going to select everything. And we're going to then say we want the background as black. And now it's turned the web page all black. If you don't want to type specific colors and you've got an exact RGB value, you can simply put hashtag and then your value. So then it's red, green, and blue, and it's a hexadecimal value. So you can either do, say, FF, which means all white. If you wanted red, green, blue, so the first one is full red, it'd be FF, and then no green, no blue, you'd get red. So this is just basic hexadecimal color values. You can play with this as well to select a color. So I'm going to go with, say, a slight purple. You can also see you can do RGBA as well, which includes a transparency to the color, which we don't want to do. So we'll remove that for now. And you can select colors here. You can see if you click here, this is the helper. This is either built into Visual Studio or built into the HTML snippets. I think it's the snippets add-in. And this shows you all different ways of defining a color. So you can do hue, saturation, and luminosity. You can do a hexadecimal red, green, blue value. You can do red, green, blue as a decimal value, so 0 to 255 in each value. And then you could obviously include the alpha channel for all of those as well. So you can play with that to figure out the colors. I typically just use a hexadecimal value. It's the most common when you're working with graphics, Photoshop, things like that. You tend to have hexadecimal values. So I can also do a shortcut. If you have, say, red as 2Fs, blue, green as none, blue as none, and you've got basically pairs here. So that's blue, that's green, that's red. If the two values are the same, then you can simply remove one of the values of each, but they all have to be the same. So all three groups have to have a single value. So if this was FFOEOO, then you're stuck with a 6-character definition. But if each group of 2 is the exact same pair repeated, you can just remove the second one and have basically a shorthand, individual character. And this expands out then, it simply doubles it. So this would expand to FF, this would expand to OO, and this would expand to OO. So you'd end up with the same color. I don't usually use the shorthand, I do in some cases, but say we want to go slightly off black, we could go in fact that's way off black, let's go say 333333, like that. Then that would bring you to this sort of grey. So instead of doing all those threes, you could just do 333 and they'd expand out to the same value. I'm going to go 111 to make it just slightly off black. So there's a background and a color, and we've applied it to the HTML document entirely. So right now what we're doing is selecting elements. So we've selected, these are elements. Each one of these is an element. Each tag is an element. So we've selected, we can basically select anything. We could select head, even though that's not a visual element, so that won't do anything. We could select body, we could select header, select P, anything we place in here we can style. So we could do, let's do another paragraph. This is a strong sentence with some EM emphasis. So we're adding plenty of tags to a paragraph. If I just maximize this a minute, you can see we've basically reduced that down slightly. You can see we just made a bunch of elements. So all these are elements. So we could select, say, the strong, but if you first take a look, we need to, all the text is black because we made the background black. So we also want to change the foreground colors, the text colors by default. So in the HTML again, let's change color, which means it really should be background, foreground is what makes sense, but obviously CSS isn't necessarily like that. So instead we have background and color. So color is foreground, and it's usually, well, it is always text. It's the default color of, anything in the foreground, any text element. So for that, we'll just make it white, and then that brings the text back to visible. And this, if I zoom in a bit, you'll see, you can probably see that's bold. That's like a stronger value. That's the default styling. So as well as us making these styles up, CSS also has, or the browsers rather, all have their own default style. So without us applying styles, if we were to look at this text, so you can right click in Firefox and inspect element, and then we can take a look at the element itself, and you can see we have, I don't think this will actually show us the default styles. Let's have a look at if the strong will show. So this isn't going to show us the default styles here. See if we can get computed. Nope. So I was hoping that would have shown us the browser's default rules, but it doesn't. But bear in mind that basically this has been styled already. You can see this is bold, so this has got a font weight that's heavier than normal. And yet it doesn't show in here because it's a browser default. If anyone knows a way to show the browser defaults, that'd be cool. But basically you've got to bear in mind that the browser will by default already style HTML without any CSS. So if we removed the style completely, you can see the heading's already big, the strong's already strong, the emphasis already got a tilt to it. So there's already styles involved, the font sizes, the spacings, the margins, and all that is classed as the default CSS. And that's different per browser. So we'll get into another video in future where we neutralize all those things and we normalize the standards because all browsers are different, so that we can create a single style that's the same in every browser. Because if we open this web page in Internet Explorer and Chrome, things would be slightly different. That the margins would be slightly off, the headings might be default, the font might be different. They style things differently by default. So before we can be assured that we write a little bit of code that turns a heading to red and a background to black, and we expect it to always be pixel perfect and looking the same, we'd have to normalize things. So we'll save that one for a future video. But in essence, you just have to remember that there's certain things that are already standard in browsers. They've already styled them. So that's kind of got a little bit off tangent there, but I needed to explain that, they do have styles already applied. So what we'll do now is, let's say this strong has got this default style applied. Let's select all strong elements and let's change that back to normal. So we don't want that. So you can either do the keyword normal and save, and you can see it's gone back to normal strength, or you can specify a value, an integer, a font weight. So 100, and it depends on the font they're using. It'd be thin. 200 is typically it's still thin, it's like semi-thin. 300 to 400 is usually regular, and again this changes based on your font that you're using, what font weights they support. 500 starts to usually go bold. 600 is then gone to back what it was basically. 900 goes really bold, but again, if your font doesn't support a weight, it simply won't show any different. Instead of specifying like the 900 and things as well, as I mentioned, you can specify bold. And you can see here the helper says bold is the same as 700. And then bolder specifies the weight of the font bolder than the inherited value. So you can use either, normal, bold, is a thin one, no, lighter, so that you've got all your specific values that you can use here. So that's how you change the thickness of a font, if you will, the weight of a font. And then we've done the same thing we've selected here. Emphasis has got the tilt on it, so let's say we wanted to remove that. I know you don't typically style things to remove things, but it's showing you what the default styles are, and then we're removing them. So the emphasis on it would be, I think it's font style. And then you have the italic, which is default. So if we went to normal, it removes that italic. We could also swap this around, and let's make the strong italic. instead of bold. Oop. And there we go. So you can see we're styling things, and all these specifics we'll get into. You know, we'll mess with lots of different styles in CSS. But the point here is to get used to this syntax. So you can see the top part is the thing we're selecting, and then you encompass it all in curly braces. And then inside here, you have the property that you want to change, so the background, then a semicolon, and then the value that you know, for that property, and a semicolon. So it's very similar to, you know, coding in different languages. Like I say, it's familiar flavor to C#. You end all lines with semicolons. You're wrapping, if you will, this section in curly braces, and you've got your definition at the top here. So I don't think that really needs much more explaining. It's fairly straightforward. It is exactly that. There's nothing special. You select something, you group it, you type the name of the thing you want to change, colon, give it the value, semicolon, and that's it. So these are selectors, as we mentioned. Let's go a bit deeper now, and let's do multiple selections. So jump back to the HTML a minute, and let's just put, say, 3 different headings in. So now we have 3 heading elements. Let's just remove the style from heading 1 for now. So you got heading 1, 2, and 3 here. Now say you wanted all of them to be color of red again, and you'd do this, and then you go, all right, now I want heading 2, so I'll copy and paste and do this, and heading 3, and so on. And if you're applying the same style to multiple elements over and over, you don't need to keep redefining like this. So if you want to simply do the same block of code, but then selecting multiple different elements, you can just put a comma here, and then the next element, a comma, and the next element, as many as you like. And when we save now, we've updated all 3. All 3 have the same style. So then if we were to do, say, font size, 14 pixels, say, and they've all now gone to the same size. So you can do, you know, style them all the same. Then there's nothing stopping you having multiple groups for the same element. So we can define H1 here as a group, so all of them go red. And then in this specific one, we can say we want the font size to be, say, smaller than the large ones. So we can readjust. We can also put another one right below. So there's no limit on how many times you define a block for an element. It doesn't matter. What does matter is the order in which they're defined. So say we have 3 things in order here, and we've effectively got a style for H1, H1, and H1. And I'll change the color here to blue. Now, when I save, what do you think will happen? Do you think this will go blue or red? Because we've told it to be both colors. So if we save, you'll see it's gone blue. And the reason for that is it's quite simply, it processes in order. So the parser will come into this HTML document, it'll work its way down, it'll hit this element here first, then it'll go into the style sheet, and it'll work its way through. It'll style H1 red, then this size, then blue. Then it will come out of the style sheet, it will go to the next one below. If we had 2 style sheets, then this will come afterwards. So it's literally a linear order, and it steps through and applies them one after the other. And when it hits a multiple item, you know, something that's already been applied, it simply gets overwritten. So it just gets replaced each time that happens. So CSS is in order of importance, if you will. And there's also, once we get into more detailed selections, there's also an importance of how defined something is. But it's hard to explain until we do more HTML and CSS, so I'll leave that a little bit out. But in essence, it's basically a simple case of it goes through in a natural order, and the further down you go is more important, so it gets overwritten. You can override that behavior, but you should use it very, very rarely. So it can get abused, and the way you do that is, once you've specified the value of any value, put a space before the semicolon, exclamation, and important, and then save. And you can see now the red has basically trumped the blue. And important means that now it's taken out of context of simple flow of, you know, this is this one, then this, and this is more important. this literally jumps the chain and says, hang on, I'm more important than anything that comes after. But this can cause a lot of issues with styling, where if you imagine you'd done this, and say somebody had made a little bit of a framework for you with some default styles for things, and they've forced this important on, but then you're in a special header for a document and you want it to be blue because you need to highlight the importance of it, but now it won't go blue, and this is in somebody else's shared CSS, or it's in a library, or it's in your own code, but quite simply you've got this important thing forcing a color. And then the only option you have then now to ever make that heading go blue is to then also include this important, to then, you know, re-trump the previous one. And you can see this ends up leading to a nasty, forceful implementation of constantly having the word important everywhere. And then, you know, as you go down the chain further and further, you're stuck in this constant cycle of having to use that. So there are small situations where important is needed, but don't typically do that. Instead, if you find yourself with, you know, two properties that are clashing and something's wrong with the order, simply fix your code, fix why that is. If this should have been before red and this is more important, simply move this above. Make it that way so that it is in the correct order. So that's the selection, multiple selection, and then a bit about the order in which things get applied. We've spoken about properties. So as I mentioned, these are properties, and these are the values to the properties. And this is where, like I say, a lot of the things will happen. There's a lot of properties that you have. And if you just press Control and space on a new line, you'll see you have a pop-up with, a lot of properties in CSS. And you can simply step through and mess with them one at a time and Google them and, work your way through. But I'll be covering most of these in the videos as we go. We'll simply be making a real website. So instead of me just going through a list of properties, you're going to learn them by actually making use of them. A few of the main ones obviously are background and color that we've used. The font weight, the font styles we've messed with. Then we have, in fact, background, you'll notice there's something special about this. So even though this is a property, this is technically, I don't know the official word, even if there is one, but I'd call this a combined property because it's combining multiple. Let's do a more obvious example first. Let's put a border around something that's a much more obvious one. So on this header 1, we're going to say border. And then what we're going to do here, instead of just saying one thing, it's going to be 1 pixel, and a space. And we'll do solid, say, and then a space, and then green, and then semicolon, and save. And you can see now around the heading, we've got a solid 1 pixel green border. But you'll notice here what I did was I separated the values by a space. So I ended up with 3 values going to one property. So you might say, well, how does that work? And this isn't really a property as such. And you can see as you hover over background, as I mentioned, which is not as obvious, and you hover over border, the pop-up says shorthand property. So whether that's the technical name, I don't know. But basically just means that this property is a quicker way of writing a style for setting the border width, the border style, and the border color independently. So this is one way of doing it, and this is where you usually do it, to make use of shorthands. If you weren't doing that, you'd have border dash, and then you can see you've got all these options. So you've got border dash width would be 1 pixel, border dash style, solid would be another, border dash color, green would be another. So instead of doing all that, this is basically the exact same thing, and this is, let's call it then, a shorthand property. And this is a quicker way of writing, those 3 things. So if we were to delete that one, you'll see you have exactly the same output. It's just that that's more compact and easy to use. And there's lots of those around. I don't tend to mention them when I use them because they're just so natural and obvious. But say another one is margin. I know we haven't spoken about margins and padding yet, but you've got margin, and then you can do margin dash left and say 50 pixels, nice big margin. And you can see this is bumped over the header. And then obviously you can imagine you've got margin left, top, bottom, right. And the shorthand for that is to simply say margin. And then in here, if you do 5, 50, 100, 200, and obviously put pixels for each of them so they know the unit of size. And you can see there, if we were to remove the 50, you don't see a change. Remove the 100, you don't see the change here. Remove 2, So in order to get the order of these, I'm pretty sure it goes left, top, right, bottom, but the order always changes. So let's just double check this. And to check this, let's just swap this over to padding for a minute, because that'll have the same effect. That's the inside. So we should see now this spacing out around wherever it is. Let's also do display. You don't need to understand this a little bit for now. I'm just proving the order. So display inline block will make it not expand the full width. And then we can see now here the padding. The first one is the top. So if we remove the 5 and put 10 there, say, so it's gone top right, and then it's going to be bottom left in this case, and then bottom and left. So in WPF, it's fairly obvious it goes round clockwise. In CSS, you'll see that it goes top, right, bottom left. So when you're doing margins, you don't always write the shorthand here. And I don't always do. In fact, I rarely use the margin shorthand for that reason, that you're constantly going, which one is it? Is it, where's top? Is it there? Where's left? It's not, in my eyes, the CSS order in this is not a logical order. Top, right, bottom, left. Well, I guess it is, if you think of it as basically it's still clockwise, it's simply starting at the top instead of the left. So actually, you just have to remember the order. But when you're jumping between things like, WPF, CSS, and I work in many other languages as well, it's easy to forget the order. So if you're in doubt, you can either mess with it and figure out, or for cleaner looking code and for more legible code, you could do, margin left is 50 pixels, margin bottom is 10 pixels, and it's more explicit. It's a little bit longer code, but it's more obvious. You also have other different shorthands as well. So a margin, you could do the top and bottom together, which is where it gets even funnier. So in order, it goes top, right, bottom, left. But then if you shorthand it to two values, like say 50 pixels and 10 pixels, what will happen is the top and bottom will be this, and the left and right will be this. So you can see the top and bottom have gone to 50, the left and right have gone to 10. So again, this is, you don't need to use these, but you just have to be aware that you can do shorthands, and then you can also remove it to a single one, and it'll make every single margin 50. So that's really shorthand properties. We'll make use of them more as we go, but I just wanted you to be aware that if you see a property with more than one value, or even like margins got one, it might actually apply to more than one underlying property. But if you hover over, you get the tooltip anyway that tells you it's a shorthand. So if we did margin, it should tell us it's a shorthand again. So there you go. And then it gives you descriptions. That's that HTML snippet. That's what's good about that little add-in. So we've got the shorthand ones. And now let's just talk about, I think the last thing we'll do in this video, and then I'll let you sort of absorb all this, because we'll be delving into more things, and I don't want to carry on in one video and kind of overwhelm you. I'll give you a chance to, comment and question things in this video and fully understand what we're talking about here, because these are the building blocks to CSS. This is the foundation that you really need to understand. And I know you haven't done much yet, but you do need to understand the concept of this is the thing that these styles have been applied to, and this is a selector, and this is what is almost like a regex filter, if you will, but a lot simpler. This is what defines what the styles get applied to, and you can do multiple selections. You can do more selectors than this as well, which we'll go into depth in a minute with a few more. But you need to understand that this is the structure. This is a group of styles, if you will, that are going to apply to this group of elements, and this is what's going to get applied. And you need to know that it's the property name, colon, and then the value or values with spaces in between, and just get that really understood. And then the order in which is important, as it's flowing through the document. If you have more than one of the same thing, which order is important. And then obviously to include it into your HTML document like this. So that's the key things you need to understand. So let's do a few more things on selection now, to give you a feel for how you'd style specific things. So as you've seen, all these elements we've styled so far have no special prefix. They don't have like a dot, they don't have a hash, they don't have arrows, they have nothing. They're just what you'd call no prefix, if you will. And what that means is the type of element you're then selecting, although the type of thing you're selecting is an element. And by element, we mean things inside of angle brackets in the HTML. So we are styling those things. Now there are, say you have, let's make this into a header, or rather this, yeah, well, let's leave out HTML5 semantics for the moment. Let's not confuse things. Let's just wrap this in a generic div, and you'll see why in future videos we won't be using many of these. So we have a div to wrap all this lot in, and then we have some headers inside the div, and let's say we have a paragraph in here, and copy and paste. This will be second paragraph. So we're just creating some kind of structure here, which is just, it's not really changed much. We've simply dumped a few things in, and then put this content in. But now let's say we have also header 2, or this paragraph inside. Right, let's say fourth. Is that how you spell fourth? I think so. Let's make the second paragraph, and again I'll jump the gun a little bit here, but well, in fact, no, let's cover this as well. So you can do styling in 2 ways, or again, let's actually jump back again. You can do styling in a lot more ways, but you can style by selecting elements in here, or by telling it specific elements want selecting based on other things. So the element, instead of it being the element itself, let's say this heading 2 has an ID of special heading, and we wanted to now style the special heading. Well, instead of having to select H2 or a div and a H2 inside a div or anything like that, we can actually select based on ID instead of element name. So to do that, instead of it just starting with nothing, just put a hash and then special heading. And now the difference here is when you've got a hash, it changes from selecting an element to looking for any element that has an ID of this value. And in true HTML specs, you should only ever have, this ID should be unique to this whole document. So you should never have 2 elements then with the same ID. So this should never happen. You can think of that like having a property inside of a class in C#, and you can't have 2 properties with the same name. Now the problem with HTML is that you can do that. It will build, it will compile, it will style, but it's technically invalid invalid HTML. So an ID is used when it really is the single identifier of an element in a document. And to select an ID, you do the hash. So now inside this hash, we will have selected the special heading to be styled. So now this element is what we're selecting. So if we then change that to, say, background of pink, you can see the styles. We still got that turned off, yeah. The styles in pink. So we've selected this element not by the fact that it's a header 2, by its ID. So we could then move this, say we want the ID to go on this paragraph instead, and save, and your style's now on the paragraph. So we've selected an element there based on ID, and this is the prefix of a hashtag and then the ID itself. So you've got elements you selected, there's no prefix. You've got a selection by ID. You can also select by class. So if we want to style an element specifically, like we wanted this whole div to be in a blue background, we could say class equals, you wouldn't typically say blue background here, like, give it a class name. You'd typically style based on, giving it a name. Say this was the header of the whole, say this was a navigation header. I know it isn't, but say it's the navigation bar of the website where you browse, home, about, products, blah, blah, blah. So you typically call this, like, say, nav bar or something, whatever you'd want to call it. And that would be the name of the class. And then if we wanted to select the class instead of the ID, instead of a hash, you simply do a dot, and then the name of the class. And then you can do background of, can't remember what it said, blue, was it? And save. and now you can see everything inside of this div, which is the 3 headers, the 4 paragraphs, has now got its background blue. And obviously this header's been styled to have its own background color, so that's pink. So that's how you select by class. And then obviously classes, you can have multiple classes. So this could have 2 different classes. Say we wanted or the navbar to have, or rather, let's say we make a generic class in here, and we call this big padding or something. And the padding is the spacing inside of the element, and the margin's the space on the outside. But we'll go through that in more detail on another video. So say we wanted the padding to be 50 whenever something's in the big padding class. So in here, just like we did with the values of the properties in CSS, to specify multiple classes, just simply do a space and then the next class name. And you can see now this div has been styled with the navbar style and the big padding style. So you can combine, you can pick and choose multiple classes, or you could simply combine it and say, this is a navbar, and I want the navbar to have the padding. And you don't need this big padding then. So that's kind of preference, and we'll get a lot more into that in future videos in terms of when you'd embed certain things together all the time, when you create helper classes that are used for, specifically styling elements, tweaking things. And one example I'll give, just so at least you can think about it, is what you tend to have is nice shorthand classes, say M0. And what this would do is remove all margins. And then, because you can use that anywhere you like, you can kind of go into, say, the heading one here and just say class M0 to quickly remove all margins around the header. And if we apply that to all 3 headers, you'll see they all then collapse together. And so that's where you can have like a class where you want to chuck a style on, a bunch of elements. Now you wouldn't use it in this exact way, because you shouldn't be defining your style in the HTML. You should simply be giving it class names or references or structure so that the CSS can select backwards correctly. But again, you'll see why there are instances in the future why you do that. But that's just an example of selecting by class, and you can have multiple classes by just doing space 0, and have multiple classes that way. So that's selecting by class. This is selecting by ID. There is another way of selecting. Well, there's 2 more ways of selecting, which you might as well touch on. There's more complicated ways, but there's 2 fairly common and pretty basic ways of selecting things. So in this one, let's do a paragraph. This is a link to Google. I'll do href, or rather, this is linked to a href google.co.uk Google A. So if I just maximize that a minute so you can see, if we did a paragraph, then we start putting the content in the paragraph. This A, which is an element, is an anchor. This is how you create a link in a website. So if we save this and take a look, you can see we've got the classic blue link, and you click it and it takes you to Google. So that's a link. That's how you make a link in HTML. I know this is CSS, but I just thought I'd chuck that in so we can start styling something on it. You can also see it was blue, now it's gone purple because we've visited it. Again, this is the default browser doing this style. So we haven't made that style, we haven't told it to be blue. That's where the browsers have done their own styling. And it's also got an underscore. But in short, the A stands for anchor, the href is the link to the website you want to go to, and then inside the anchor is the physical text that obviously you click to do that link, to go to that link. So let's select the A by element first. So you can simply say all links in the website will have green color instead of the blue or whatever. So now you can see it's gone to green. And now there's another way of selecting something, and it's called a pseudo selector. And that is something that it's not really an element. It doesn't appear in here. So there's no definition here. There's no class. There's no ID. That's why they call it pseudo, because pseudo simply means, well, I guess the definition on Wikipedia might be different, but my interpretation of pseudo simply means, not real. It's fabricated, if you will. So a pseudo selector, and one that we're going to do here is when you hover over a link, what you see the link sometimes on websites changing color or behaving differently. So how do you style that in CSS? Well, the way you do that is with these pseudo styles. And one of them is called hover for a link. So when you're hovering over a link, you want to style it differently. But in order to select something that isn't really a physical element in the HTML, we use the pseudo selector. And that, instead of starting with something like this, it technically does starts with a colon, but because we want to select the anchors only, so the links only first, and then you do a pseudo selector colon and do hover. And that is then saying I want to select all anchors, and then I want to select the pseudo element of hover, so when it's hovered. So when you're hovering over a link now, let's change the color to white. And now if we hover over the link, you'll see it changes color to white. So that is a pseudo selector, and there's many of those again. So if you do a hover, a colon, and then press Control and space, it'll pop up with these pseudo selectors, and you can see there's lots of them. And again, we'll go through specific ones. And I think there's one for visited as well. So as we mentioned, once the link is visited, you might want to change the color. So color could go to, let's say brown. So once a link's been visited, it's gone to this brown color. If we change the link to a website we've never been to, which is Google, which I don't think exists. Mind you, it probably does now in the internet. I don't know whether I dare click this now. No, it doesn't exist. So once you've visited the link, it goes brown, and then you go to a website you've never visited, it goes green. I don't tend to style links on visited, and I don't think any website in the modern age does anyway, because you don't want your website looking different just because you've gone to a link. But that's another pseudo selector to do that. So we've got that there, and I think really that forms a lot of the ways in which, well, almost all of the ways you'll typically use in 90% of your style to select elements, and then we simply need to style them. So a lot of this intro video has mainly been about how you would select and style certain things, and not so much about the specific styles. We'll go into that in the next video. But again, this is really what a lot of people struggle with when they get into CSS. Is I think they overlook the importance of this first step. Is you need to understand how you'd select something with a style, and you need to understand the importance of drilling down and getting to the specific elements you want to style, because you typically get somebody going, well, I don't know, say, why isn't my heading styling, or why is my header always blue when I've told it to be red, or vice versa, because they haven't understood the importance of the process of which it selects it, or they think they've selected it and they've done maybe a hash in H1, or they've put a class on something called navbar and they haven't put the dot in front. And all of the issues you typically see with CSS revolve around the fact that they just haven't done this bit right. So you really want to understand these selections and have a play yourself, move things around, create some things that aren't even in here yet, like create a span, and then, try and style the span. I could type and talk at the same time. There we go. And try and style this and say, make that text big, and then do other things. And that's really, the major importance there. So get that down, and then I think the next video we will, well, in fact, let's carry on and do a little bit more first. I wasn't going to do the selection of going into depth of specifics, like nailing down and say, like a good example here now is, what if you want to style a span that's only inside a navbar? So you want just this span here, and if we put a span here outside, you want this span to be, say, red text, but only inside this navbar. So in your style here, you have navbar, but then how would you style a span inside that? Unfortunately, in CSS, you can't nest things. You can't go inside here and say span and then start typing in here. We'll move on to Sass very shortly, which allows this. But for now, CSS doesn't allow that. So what you have to do is start a new class below. And this time, you can do a different type of selector. Basically, it's kind of combining the two selectors, if you will. So you still want to select the navbar. But then if you want to select something inside of the navbar, just press space and type the next selection. So as if you were doing another selection. So if we did span like this, we styled all spans, say do, well, no, you won't see black. Say do brown again. So all spans have gone brown. So that's how you select a span. Your navbar's got a background of blue. So that's how you select a navbar. But if you wanted to select just the span inside the navbar, then you do .navbar space span. And now this, unlike the values that combine, this isn't a combined selector. This is a span that's inside a navbar. This is a combined selector. So this is when you put a semicolon, when you put a comma between them, this is one item, this is another, this is another. And this simply expands out to being, the same style per one. When you do a space, this is still a singular item. So this is only ever going to select this specific thing. It can select multiple items, but it's only one thing that you're selecting. And that is a span inside a navbar. You're not selecting the navbar. You're selecting the last element in this set of spaces, and it's a span. So ultimately, you're styling a span, but you're only going to style it if it's inside a navbar class. So in that case, we do color. What's a really obvious color different than that? Let's go purple. That's not really obvious. That doesn't show. Let's go white. In fact, white's the default. I'm not doing good here. Let's do green. There we go. In fact, let's remove this blue background. That's what's really throwing everything off. Navbar, get rid of that. Just put a border around this instead a minute. So you can see here now, we've selected just this span, and the other span is unaffected because it hasn't matched this prefix. So when you're doing this kind of selector, and you do just a space between two elements, it means that any span inside of navbar is going to be green. And that also means if you have a span and then you have a div here, and let's say another div and a span inside of that, my embedded span, I think I keep saying spam, I'm not eating the spam meat, it's span with an N. So this is an embedded one. You can see, even though it's inside a div, inside another div, and then it's there, it's still green. So when you do a space, it doesn't matter about the level of descendants, how many children or how many parents it's got. So technically this is a child of this div, and this div's a child of this div, and this div's a child of this div, which is the navbar. So a space doesn't care about that. It'll simply keep searching deeper and deeper and deeper, and if it ever finds a span, it will be styled. So if you want to go slightly further and you only want to style the span that appears as a direct child of navbar and not any embedded spans, then you can do the same thing again, navbar span, but all you have to do is add a greater than symbol, which if you kind of think of that as the closing bracket to the navbar here, it's kind of saying it's within the navbar, but directly within. So it's basically anything that goes inside of, say, a div now, and it's inside here, this won't get styled. So it's a direct selection. So if we have all spans going green and only the direct descendants going blue, you can see then we've got a this one blue, this one green, this one red, through a combination of selecting. So these two are important. I'd say these are more complicated ones. Let's do one more. And again, there are more than this, but at least if I show them you can have a play before the next video and have a mess around and do things like this. Just test styling things on it. So I think we'll do two more. Let's say we have 4 spans in a row, or spans are bad because we'll jerry rig this, because you can see a span is going one after the other, because a span is what's called inline. It follows in line, it doesn't start a new thing like a paragraph does. So let's do the paragraphs instead, actually. So in these paragraphs here, you've got 4 paragraphs. Say you wanted to style the first paragraph. Well, no, let's ignore that because that's just a pseudo selector. Well, in fact, there's a good option. I can show you. Say you wanted to style the first paragraph inside of anything. You could just do p : first, color blue. Or rather not that then, no, let's ignore that bit. We will do the, say you want to select I'm trying to think which one I'm doing here. We want to select a paragraph. Yeah, say we want to select a second paragraph, or the next sibling, if you will, is how I guess you'd describe it. So you make a selection, but then you want it to be the thing after that selection. So let's say we selected, well, there's a good example. Let's put P. This is right after the nav bar. And again, there's very few cases where you do this. But say you have a nav bar and you have an element after it, and whatever that element is, doesn't matter what it is, you want it to style that. So what you'd want to do is select the element after the nav bar. So how would you do that? You'd basically select the nav bar first, and then you'd do, I believe it's the tilde, and let's just say star. So the thing we're selecting after this could be, P, could be span, it's just another selector. Star means select absolutely anything. Again, you should rarely use this, but for an example, this should do. So let's do, in this case, background white, for whatever that does. And you can see now, this has selected everything after the nav bar, and turned the backgrounds to white. Now, this is because we've done the tilde here, which means every child after the nav bar, and it only works inside of its siblings, if you will. So here's the nav bar. If we collapsed it, if we select the nav bar and then do a tilde to select everything after it, it's going to only select these things. It's not going to select anything, outside of its parent. So if we wrapped the nav bar inside a div like this, and we included just these 2 elements and saved, you can see that it stops at my span. As soon as it breaks out of its parent, which is here, the thing that's containing the nav bar, the selector stops working. So that will only select things in what is called siblings. So, its own children, well, it's not its children, it's brothers and sisters, if you will, if you're talking about, like family trees, but it basically means siblings. So these are the siblings, and this is the parent. So this selector is basically a sibling selector that selects anything that comes after this element. So anything that comes after a nav bar, and because we did star, will get styled white. If we wanted to style only paragraphs, so let's copy and paste a few of them. If we want to select a few paragraphs that come after nav bar, but not spans, then just change the selector to paragraphs, and it will only style the paragraphs. So that's a sibling selector to select every sibling. And finally, I think the last one is you can select just the next sibling. I think it's a plus. And if we changed it to blue background, you can see the plus, similar to what I was going to explain as the first thing, which we'll do in another video. I don't want to go to that level yet, the pseudo selector first. This plus is just like the tilde, in which that it simply selects the first element after, though. So you can see this is right after the nav bar, it's gone blue, but all the others have been caught by this and have gone white. So you have these 4 really are kind of advanced selectors, and they might have gone over most people's heads, and we will go into depth more about them in future videos. So don't worry if you haven't understood these, because we've covered quite a lot in this video, and you might be scratching your head and going, well, you might not understand anything past. I should certainly hope you understand element selection, ID selection, class selection. You should understand pseudo selectors in terms of it's simply a way of selecting a state of an object, if you will, that isn't really a thing, is I guess a way of explaining it. And the classic one is like a hover on a link. So you might get this, it might take a bit more learning. But these ones really are more for people that really want to know a bit more and maybe have found this video a bit easy, and maybe you've done HTML before. You just want to, try and get a bit further while they're waiting for the next video. So don't worry if you don't understand these 4. I will go into more depth about these in the future videos, but I did just want to try and cover all the selectors, at least in the starter video, so that you have a good example of how to select anything. And we'll just quickly run through these again. So this one, it selects any span that's inside of a nav bar at any level. So that means there's the nav bar. It will select this span, but it will also select this span. It'll select any span that's anywhere inside the nav bar. To limit that to just the first set of children, so just this lot here and nothing else, you use the greater than symbol. And then similarly, this is siblings. So instead of things inside of navbar, it's the siblings of the navbar. Anything that comes after it, or in this case, not anything that comes after it, whatever this selection is met. So any P in this case that comes after the navbar, which would be not here because that's the navbar itself. It would be these P's here. So the tilde would catch all these, and it stops once it hits the parent. It doesn't carry on outside and start selecting these. And then finally, the plus is the same again. It selects the siblings of the navbar, but it'll only select the very next sibling. So that's kind of the selection there. Again, there are even more complicated selectors, which I believe one is like, colon not and things. But again, we won't go into pseudo selectors as in depth yet. This is like one example. There's more, but they really are getting to a bit more advanced level. We don't want to confuse anything further. So hopefully this has been enough information to get you going with CSS, to help you start playing with some CSS and HTML. And then in the next video, I think we'll cover, let's go into some, now you know how to select things, and you don't need to focus too much on selecting. We can start focusing on some styling. Again, any questions you've got, do feel free to just comment. I do get back to every comment. Anything that wasn't clear, let me know. And then I hope you enjoyed this video.